My name is Gert from the Bijl. And what I want to do in the next half hour more or less is give you a brief overview of European legislation, what we know about it at the moment, give a very short thought to you what I think the consequences will be. But I'm looking forward to an exchange with you here, because we have a lot of intelligence here and knowledge from the situation in Peru and what consequences will be, but also what it is that you can do. And they're the real specialist on consequences and what can be done. That's you and not me, so there I want to be modest. Gonzalo already told me that I have been working for Solidaridad for around 13 years. For those of you who don't know Solidaridad, I guess most of you will do. Solidaridad is an international development organization working in sustainability and supply chains around the globe. So I work in our European office, and Peru is one of the 35, 40 countries in the world where we have offices and where we work on the ground with producers in cocoa, coffee, but also in palm oil and gold. Then change to the subject. And I think first of all it's good to realize that the European Union is preparing quite a number of different legislations, proposals on sustainability. All of them as part of the overall aim to reach climate neutrality by 2050, which is a huge task. And I want to mention two policies that I think are relevant also for Peru. There are others, like there is a ban on products on forced labor being prepared. There will be a lot of legislation also on sustainability, reporting. But the two I want to highlight here is first of all the due diligence legislation. The proposal from the European Commission has been presented early this year, and it will require companies above a certain size to set up due diligence practices or systems within their company to identify, prevent, mitigate and terminate adverse impacts in their supply chain. That is still under discussion and is likely to be implemented in around 2-3 years' time from now. So that will take some time. I will focus my presentation on the second one that was already mentioned before, deforestation regulation, because I think, and I'm quite certain that this will have a lot of impact on the supply chains and producers here in Peru, most of all, of course, in cocoa and coffee. The general idea of this legislation is that Europe wants to have its supply chains deforestation free. And what that means I will explain later. This regulation, as been said before, is really expected to be enforced in due course, and that's why I'm happy to be here and to present this, because I really think it's important to be prepared for it and to see how in the end this can have maybe not negative impact but positive impact on the developments here. So this is the title in Spanish of this deforestation regulation or proposal coming from the European Commission. I will explain a bit more about the European policy process, but the European Commission is the cabinet, more or less, of Europe. Yesterday it was exactly 1 year ago that they have presented this proposal. And it says that it's about commercialization of products, both entering and exporting, so anything that is marketed in Europe. So it's for products imported in Europe, but also for products produced in Europe itself and products exported from Europe. And as you may know, there was already a legislation on wood requiring legality of wood imports in the European Union, and this regulation will replace that. So I think it's good to realize that it's not fully set in stone how the legislation will look like. So most of what I will explain is about the proposal that the European Commission has presented 1 year ago. I think it's good to understand that there is quite a complicated policy process in Europe, and I explain that not because the policy process as such is so interesting, but because it's important to realize what the status is. So 1 year ago the Commission presented a proposal, then the Council, which is the 27 states of Europe together, they have discussed this and reached a compromise in June. The European Parliament has had a very long process of discussing around it in different committees, and they voted on amendments in September. So there are now 3 different positions. What I think it's important, first of all, to realize that all 3 agree on the overall lines in the proposal. The Council has made some proposals to change it, and the European Parliament has made some proposals to change it. And they are now negotiating between the 3. And on the 5th of December, it's expected that they will agree on a compromise. That's not certain yet. It can also be January or February if they manage. But from what I hear from policymakers is that they still think that they can reach an agreement on December 2022, and that would mean that 1 year later it will be in force. So it will be published briefly afterwards. Then we know exactly all the details. And it will be then enforced 1 year later. So maybe first, before I explain about the legislation, a bit of background on why Europe is preparing this legislation. And I think the main thing that needs to be mentioned is the overall importance of deforestation in climate gas emissions. Overall, 11% of all global greenhouse gas emissions are related to deforestation, with agriculture by far being the largest source of deforestation. And if you follow a bit about the discussions at COP27 on climate in Egypt, which is almost finished, then there is a lot of talk on how can we reduce deforestation. And what the European Union also realized is that around 10% of the global deforestation, and that figure is even still going up, was caused by products that are imported in the European Union. So they are embodied in EU imports. And this is what Europe really wants to tackle. And well, then Europe made an overview of what. Sorry?
No, if you can speak louder.
Okay. I will try to speak louder. Closer to the telephone or to the microphone, that will also help. Thank you. So what the European Union concluded is that around 90% of this deforestation footprint of imports is coming from 6 commodities, where soy and palm oil are the most important ones, but coffee and cocoa also play a very important role. 9% or 8% of this deforestation imported is from coffee and cocoa. So that's why coffee and cocoa have been included in the proposal. In this graph you see the development of imported deforestation still going up and expected to go up, and certainly expected to go up for coffee, because due to climate change in a number of countries, the analysis shows that the area is becoming higher and higher. In low areas, coffee has problems due to climate change, which will bring, if we don't take measures, more deforestation. So that's why the European has included these commodities, but the European Union also looked at, well, what have we done over the last, let's say, 10, 15 years, and has that been successful? Well, the overall conclusion from that analysis was that there has been a lot of voluntary measures from companies, from governments, supporting also companies sometimes, but overall with very little success in preventing deforestation. And also what the European Union concluded from a survey that there is abundant literature showing that certification schemes on their own have not been able to really give the changes that is needed to reduce deforestation. And in describing the proposal, I will come back on the role of certification schemes a bit more. And what they also say is that, well, there have been a number of European companies that have acted on deforestation and are really taking measures. And they are in an unequal position in the market with those companies that don't do anything. So that's why they want to force all companies to act and to reduce deforestation in their supply chain. So then to the proposal itself. So this is from the European Commission proposal. Well, they first of all named the products that are included. So that is palm oil, beef, soy, wood, plus coffee and cocoa. And I think at this place it's also relevant to describe what is coffee and cocoa in the proposal. It's not only about coffee beans or cocoa beans, and it's coffee whether it's roasted or not, it's coffee husk, skins, coffee substitutes if they contain coffee. So quite a broad category of products with coffee. The same for cocoa. It includes beans, but also butter, paste, fat and oil, and even chocolates and products that contain chocolate. So from a year onwards, if you export chocolates to the European Union, you need to prove that it has been produced deforestation free. And yeah, I think everyone will realize that this is huge. And so the general idea behind the proposal is that if you want to have products on the market, it needs to be deforestation free, which means produced on land not deforested after the 31st of December 2020. This is not 100% certain, because the European Council proposed, so the Member States, 31st of December 2019, and the European Parliament proposed 31st of December 2021. But with these three positions, 2019, 2020 and 2021, I think it's not really difficult to think of what the compromise will be. The compromise is likely to be this one. But second, and that's also an important one to realize, the products should be produced according with the law of the production country. Well, member states will then, in the European Union, will be responsible for enforcement, with the possibility to include very huge fines, until 4% of the turnover of the products concerned of the company. But the most important thing is that if you can't prove that you comply, you can't export the products to Europe. So in the end, the objectives of the European Commission are twofold. One, as they state in the proposal, they want to ensure that supply chains of deforestation commodities ending up in Europe are deforestation free. The second is they want to reduce deforestation. And well, one of the things that we have discussed a lot with the European policymakers is that this is not necessarily the same. You can reduce deforestation in supply chains, but it doesn't necessarily mean that also deforestation is going to be reduced. And I think that's something to realize. and I will come back to that later on. So more in detail about the proposal. The first one is information requirements for all products on the market. So this is information that anyone bringing a product on the market in Europe will need to have and make available to the authorities that are responsible for import checks. The first one, and that I think will be absolutely a very, very impactful one, and where a lot of countries still need to do a lot, is that for all products on the market, you will need to have geolocation coordinates. So you need to have evidence of all the plots of land where the relevant commodities were produced, including when, and that will, in the end, will be uploaded in a satellite system so that the European Union can also check if it's right. But this also means that you don't only need to have this geolocation, but the products also need to be traceable. So if you enter the harbor of Rotterdam or Hamburg or whatever with a product, you will have to have a traceability until the plot. And I think this is really something to realize and to think of, are we already prepared for this? There are still discussions about this in the political process, and one of the things under discussion proposed by the member states is to add a requirement that if land is more than 10 hectares, you will also need to have polygons. So not only one spot, but exact indications of the area where it has been grown. It's not sure that this will be included in the final legislation, but most people expect it will. So if the land is more than 10 hectares, it's likely that polygons will be needed. And it's also expected that in the future, this let's say limit of 10 hectares will go down to, let's say, 5-6 years, maybe 2 hectares. So I think those countries, those producers, those cooperatives that are already working on polygons, they have an advantage, and it's definitely necessary to work on geolocations. Secondly, you need to add information that the products are produced deforestation-free. And that gives a lot of discussion, and has given a lot of discussion, and is still discussed. What then is exactly deforestation-free, or what is exactly a forest? The definition that the European Commission used, and that is most likely to be in the compromise, is coming from the FAO, but the FAO has more definitions, but the one they used is a forest is an area with more than half a hectare, with trees higher than 5 meters and more than 10% canopy. Well, that excludes some of the savanna areas, for instance, and it's also quite certain that this will be changed over time to make sure that all, let's say, high biodiversity expansion will be included, but it's likely that this will be the starting point as a definition. And then thirdly, companies will need to provide information to show that production has been done in compliance with local laws. And that's not only laws about deforestation, but also laws about land use, which for instance means that production needs to be legal and farmers need to have land titles, which is a challenge in some places, but also in compliance with human rights laws, for instance on labor. So this is the basic set of information that a company bringing a product on the market in Europe will need to provide. And of course, the company providing this information will depend on suppliers in the supply chain and will ask this from their suppliers. So in the end, it will be translated to exporters here, and it will be translated to producers and cooperatives here, and it will be information that can only be provided if translated down the supply chain, and will have impact for all actors in the supply chain. Well, then companies need to do a risk assessment to highlight the risk. This is the due diligence part, so to make sure that they know what the risks of deforestation and other issues are, and they need to make sure that this risk is close to zero. And if it's not close to zero, the products will not be allowed on the market. And then the third interesting thing is that the legislation also includes what the European Commission calls country benchmarking. Also a thing that has been highly debated, and where still it's not certain if this will be the final text. But the overall idea of the European Commission is that countries or regions will be divided in 3 different risk categories. And then the risk, of course, is the risk that deforestation may occur in the area and may be included in the supply chain. And if a country has a certain label of risk, that will be for all products. So whether it's palm oil, soy, beef, or cocoa. In the beginning, all countries will be labeled as standard. Then the Commission will start a process where they say it will be independent and with external knowledge, where the regions or countries will be classified as either low risk, standard or high risk, based on past experience in the cases of deforestation, but also related to how much a country is engaged in fighting deforestation. Well, nobody knows which country will be in what category, and well, I will also leave it to you to judge or think where Peru will be. No, I'm not going to say anything about it. I will leave that to you. And based on these risk categories, the obligations will differ. Wherever a country is, even if there's no deforestation at all, that requirement of geolocations and traceability will be there for every product. Even if it's soy from the US, where there's no deforestation, the geolocation requirement and traceability needs to be there. And I can tell you that the US really doesn't like this. They have to do this if they want to export. So this first geolocation and traceability will be there for all produce, wherever it comes from. And then for products coming from low-risk regions, this requirements on checking if it's deforestation-free, but also on legality, will be less strong than for other regions. And for countries within the high-risk category, there will be extended requirements, so more checks and more control for companies importing that product. I think it's also important to realize here that in the end, the European Commission proposes this with the idea that if we include a high-risk category, that will stimulate countries to take measures and to give an incentive that they will be part of other categories, low risk or standard. What I also hear from companies, including retailers, is that of course the risk is that once your country is in a high risk category, some buyers in Europe will say, well, I don't want products from countries with a high risk category. So I think this is, well, something to be really seriously considered, and I really hope for Peru that Peru will not be in this high risk category, and also encourage you to work with the European Commission to avoid this. Okay, then one side step, I think it's also important to realize that Europe is not the only buyer that is preparing legislation. In the USA, there are two different policy initiatives, one from the State Department and one from the Congress, to introduce legislation on import and deforestation as well. It is in a far more earlier stage than in Europe, and well, as you know, anything in American policy is uncertain. So it's also uncertain if this legislation will pass. But in the Congress in the US, there is a proposal also saying that imported products will need to be traceable, and you need to show where it's coming from. So that is exactly the same as in the European policy. The difference is that this is not about all deforestation, but about illegal deforestation only. So you need to prove, is the proposal there, that if you import in the US, it shall not come from land that has been illegally deforested. And one other important difference is that coffee is not included in this proposal, cocoa is. Well, the UK, well, of course, a much smaller market, is also preparing legislation where coffee and cocoa are both included, also focusing on illegality. Well, then a few other observations and remarks I want to make. And one is that in the proposal, the European Commission has said they really think they should cooperate with producing countries and that they should support smallholders in producing countries. Article 28 says that the Commission shall engage with producer countries to develop partnerships and cooperation and to work with producer countries to make the transition to facilitate the compliance. So far this has been nice wordings, and there has not been much of a translation to really set this in motion. So a lot of the work that I have been doing over the past 2 years together with other organizations has been to stimulate Commission and Parliament to really make work out of this and to concretize this. Because I think if you really want to make sure that you don't only work on supply chains without deforestation, but really want to make it have a positive impact on the ground, it is important and crucial that the European Union will work with actors here on the ground, with exporters, with producers, to really reduce deforestation. This is also a bit overlapping with a letter that 14 producing countries sent in July to the European Commission. 14 producing countries, including Peru, sent by ambassadors of these 14 countries in Brussels, where they say that, they regret that the European Union is preparing unilateral legislation disregarding local conditions, including burdensome mechanisms, and that they also think it's important that we should avoid to penalize producers, especially smallholders. Well, this last point is definitely a point that we as Solidaridad, together with other NGOs, have been hammering on a lot. And they call on the European Union to create a substantial dialogue with producing countries, where I agree that the European Union has not done enough so far. Well, then looking at what the impact will be, And as I said, you are all in a much better position to judge what the impact in Peru will be than I am. But if you look at different sectors, I think it's important to realize, first of all, that cocoa and coffee are the two products where Europe has a very large market share globally. So around 40–50% of all cocoa and coffee in the world is going to the European Union. So that makes it that the influence of Europe in producing countries is much higher than for palm oil or soy, where around 20% of the production is going to Europe. And in those sectors, producers may easily have another alternative, which is less easy in cocoa and coffee. And of course, you can indeed still export to China, but the price difference for cocoa and coffee is likely to be larger, as also the exporter here explained. Overall, the European Union considers cocoa and coffee as the more easy supply chains. Because soy is bulk and palm oil is complicated with a lot of products. But that oversees one important thing, and that is both coffee and cocoa are the two sectors dominated by smallholders, where in the end the importance is to make sure that this will not penalize smallholders, but is in the end done in such a way that smallholders will benefit. And that has been our overall message at Solidaridad for the past 2 years. Because I think what is a risk or what may happen is one, that the regulation will stimulate companies not to buy from regions where there is a high risk of deforestation, whereas what we have been trying to say and to convince the Parliament and the Commission, that if you want to reduce deforestation, you don't need to walk away, you shouldn't walk away from regions where there is a problem, but cooperate and engage to work on solutions. And a second risk that we have constantly mentioned is the risk that costs will be pushed down to smallholders, and that in the end they will be the ones to bear all the burdens, which and I think should be avoided. So to avoid this to happen, well, together with other NGOs, we have been advocating for improved regulation, but also accompanying measures, but also have been in contact with a lot of organizations, and that's again why I'm happy to be here, to make sure that organizations, be it farmers, be it cooperatives, be it SMEs or exporters, are prepared and make the best out of it. Well, the European Parliament has adopted a number of amendments proposed by a coalition of NGOs, including Solidaridad, making more explicit that the European Union really must cooperate with producing countries and make work out of that, that companies need to prove that they also have supported smallholders in compliance and not just push down the cost to smallholders, and that cost of compliance will be shared in a fair way, and that the European Union should make sure that they assess the impact of the regulation on smallholders, monitor that and act on that. Well, what I understand is that in the negotiations, this large part is still on the table, and that the European Commission will, from the beginning on, monitor impact on smallholders. And I also want to call upon you, if you see negative impacts or have proposals to have a more positive impact on smallholders, do reach out to us or the European Commission, because I think it's really important that this is on the table. Well, the European Union has done some research on what the impact will be, but all this research is not public. So I had a meeting with one of the researchers, and if I don't mention her name, I'm allowed to share it. And she had done research in Honduras, which I think is in a lot, well, maybe a bit comparable with the situation here. And one of the conclusions there was that a real problem is that land registration and land titles are not up to date, and that this will be a real problem for producers there. But also that there has been some work on geolocations, but that it's far from complete, and that a lot needs to be done to ensure that this is done in a decent way and includes all producers. And what she said may well be the most important thing is that record keeping, registration and administration of a lot of farmers' organizations and cooperatives is not up to date, and sometimes still working with shoeboxes full of paper, and that a lot of improvement is needed there, because in the end cooperatives will need to be able to prove compliance if they want to export to Europe. So I think also for you people here, well, you're much more aware of the situation here, but I think this is the kind of things that also should be thought about here. So some of my final remarks. I think it is really important for producers and traders to be prepared for this upcoming legislation. And I think what first thing that could or should be done, and if I hear the exporter, work is already being done, but make sure that this is really done in a joint way, is to map the consequences of this draft legislation, see where you are at the moment and what needs to be done to bridge the difference, and then work on the joint agenda. And as I said, you are all in a much better position than I am to judge what is needed, but do map these consequences and make sure that you know what the situation is. And then secondly, I would urge you to, or stimulate, or maybe suggest you to work on building supply chain relations, so that traceability can be done and that you work together on preparing for the legislation, make sure that producers, cooperatives can meet the requirements and jointly reduce deforestation, where in the end it should all be about. And finally, work together to make sure that farmholders can earn a decent income, and also think of how the requirements that are part of this legislation can be used in a positive way, to stimulate agroforestry, to work on carbon sequestration, and maybe also to ensure that Peru will be seen as a high quality, high sustainable exporter of coffee and cocoa in the future. Thank you.
Tenemos un pequeño espacio para preguntas. Me han llegado algunas preguntas que vamos a ver en el panel, referidos al impacto en Perú. La vamos a pasar para el panel. Voy a aprovechar para hacerle preguntas que tienen más que ver con la norma. Hay una pregunta que dice si el nivel de riesgo, si el nivel de riesgo para clasificar al país va a estar determinado por la conexión de la deforestación del cultivo, del producto, o si ese nivel de riesgo va a incluir otros factores y el nivel de riesgo está conectado a la deforestación en general. So the question is if there is knowledge about how this risk classification will take place, the criteria that will be applied by the European Union, if this will be directly connected with the deforestation, connected with the crops, or the risk will be defined by general deforestation that can happen due to other causes or sources of deforestation.
Good question. As far as I understand, it will be more from a general perspective. And also the benchmarking of countries will be for the country or a region, can also be a regional level, as such. So not differentiate between sectors or say, well, in Peru for coffee the risk is high and for palm oil is low. So there will be an overview of deforestation in these 6 related to the 6 supply chains, that I think will be the case. But an overall analysis of the amount of deforestation, development of deforestation, what is the country doing, and so it will in the end not be separated between commodities.
Otra pregunta tiene que ver sobre si el nivel de riesgo va a ser general para un país o va a haber niveles de riesgo por subregión. Esto es particularmente importante para países grandes, pero podría aplicarse a Perú.
Yeah, I understand. In the original proposal, the last draft, the European Commission said countries. In the final proposal, they added the possibility for regions. So it can be countries, but also regions. So if there is a really different situation in a certain region, there is a possibility that the European Commission, stimulated by countries possibly as well, will say, well, this region will have a different benchmarking than the country as such.
Luego hay dos preguntas más interesantes. La primera es, ¿qué incentivos o medidas piensas que está implementando la Unión Europea para ayudar a los pequeños productores? Si es que va a haber, porque una cosa es la norma, y otra cosa es cómo generas incentivos, ayudas, programas para que ellos puedan alinearse en la norma. ¿Hay algo que puedas decir sobre eso?
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing that we as Solidaridad with a number of NGOs have been hammering on for the last 2 years, already long before the proposal was published. The European Union is working on forest partnerships with countries, and the first 5 of them have been published. And in the end, and with I think Cameroon, DRC, Mongolia, but those forest partnerships are not necessarily related to this legislation. And in the end, I think it will be up to the country, together with the delegation of the European Union in their multi-annual plan, to ensure that this is included. But there is a lot of pressure, and I said that we have been hammering on this, but I'm glad that we have not been the only one that increases the pressure on the European Commission and the European Parliament. There is a lot of pressure on the European policymakers to ensure that there are agreements also with countries, because in the end, this will only have a positive impact or the required impact if producing countries and producing regions are aligned with this. And one thing that I want to add here also is that the way it will work will be different from how it works with certification. It will not be a product that will have a different position on the market. So it's not likely that there will be a premium in the market in Europe, because all products will need to meet these requirements. And there has also been a lot of discussions about the links between certification and this proposal. And a lot of people still think, well, if we are certified, then we are okay. And that is not necessarily the case. And the European Commission has also formulated in the proposal that certification is not a proof of compliance. So you will need, as a company, prove compliance even if you have certified products. So, and information from certification can help, but there is no certification yet that includes all the requirements that are there. So, and I have met quite a number of companies that say, well, our products are certified, so we're okay. That's not necessarily the case. And for instance, organic products, there are no requirements about deforestation. There are no requirements about legal compliance. So if your product is organic, you still need to meet all the requirements before. But the difference is if you have certified, there is often a premium, and this is not likely to be the case here.
Bueno, esa era la pregunta que te iba a hacer y él la respondió, ¿no? Sobre que la certificación en sí misma no va a ayudar directamente, ¿no?
Para ayudar.
Va a ayudar directamente, claro. O sea, la norma va a establecer un qualifier, un calificador para entrar o no al mercado. Y la certificación puede ayudar, pero no es una condición necesaria y suficiente. Muy bien. Gracias, Gert. Un aplauso.